In this video, I'm going to talk about the process of survey writing and creation. This is a process that might seem like it would be very simple and straightforward, writing questions to ask people about how they feel or their behavior. Writing good quality survey questions and questionnaires is actually a little bit trickier than you might think. And there's some pitfalls and mistakes that people make when they're writing surveys that are detrimental to the quality of the survey. So writing surveys that are both clear and effective is a little bit trickier than you might expect. So if we're talking about survey creation, this is really all about ways to ask various questions. So sort of living in the world of self-report. Surveys are all about how you actually tailor, create, and write the questions that you are going to create. So survey, poll, and questionnaire, these are all somewhat interchangeable words that basically mean the same thing. It's going to be a set of questions that are posed to your participants either in a written or verbal format aimed to help uncover something in the context of psychology about their attitudes, emotions, or behaviors. A census is a distinct type of survey in that a census is any survey that's administered to the entirety of a population. So likely you or your family have been bugged a lot this year because it's a census year. The United States government takes a census every 10 years where they do seek to get information from every person in the United States by sending the census to all households and getting information about every individual in that household. The purpose of the census is really to get a collection of data from everyone because that information is used for things like determining where financial resources should be devoted in various communities. For our purposes, we're typically not dealing in censuses in the field of psychology. We're typically dealing with sampling from a population to try and uncover something about the population. So we're going to talk about sampling next time, but basically when we are typically doing this form of research in psychology, we're going to be dealing with a survey and not a census. So you can break down surveys into a variety of subcategories. So it could be questionnaire versus interview. I know I mentioned survey, poll, and questionnaire are basically interchangeable, and for the most part they are, but a different distinction of a survey type would be an interview. So not all interviews are necessarily polls or questionnaires. They might be more so chats or conversations that researchers have with participants, either in person or virtually. So technically an interview is a type of survey. But when we think surveys, more often we're thinking that branch to the right of various questionnaires. Distinctions of questionnaires is that it could be your classic physical paper and pencil questionnaire where you fill out a series of questions on a clipboard, or more and more questionnaires are going to occur virtually. As you guys have done when you created your 293 projects, you created a virtual set of surveys or questionnaires. If we're talking surveys, a different axis that they can be broken down into is the level of structure that the survey has. So a survey that's completely unstructured is one where there's limited prompting that directs participants to answer very specific questions, sort of just letting participants riff and talk and write as much as they want without a lot of direction. That would be a completely unstructured survey. A very structured survey, on the other hand, is going to be when very, very specific questions are asked to participants and they have very, very limited ways of responding. So for example, a series of written multiple choice questions to which participants have a limited set of ways to respond. That would be a completely structured survey. You can also go that middle road where you have semi-structure, where some of the questions are completely structured and participants are prompted to respond in very specific ways, but other parts of the survey create those opportunities for participants to riff a little bit more freely. Then lastly, if we're talking about breakdowns of surveys, is the content of the surveys. So a survey is typically broken up into various scales and items. A scale is going to be a component of a survey where there's a set of questions that all belong together. So if you ever, for example, in your 293 project, used the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale or the Beck Depression Inventory, Those are a series of questions that all belong together that assess the same construct. So many surveys are comprised of a variety of scales that assess different categories of constructs, and all the items in the scale belong together. This term item refers to the specific questions that constitute the survey. So any scale is broken down of specific items, that is to say the questions that belong in a given scale. So any survey can have a breakdown of the items contained within them. So your survey might have a variety of scales, or there might be different standalone questions or items. For example, if you ever took like a demographic survey, there would be an item probably to assess gender, a different item to assess age, one to assess ethnicity. The idea is that all of those questions are a little bit different, so those are all distinct items. And lastly, surveys can either be existing ones that you use. So when I was haranguing you guys in 293 to use pre-published scales, that was because I was encouraging you to use existing surveys. The reason it's easier to use existing surveys is that it's just less effort, because the alternative is to create new survey questions, items, and scales completely from scratch. So if you use an existing survey, you can really just use it whole as long as you cite whoever actually wrote or created the scale or survey. You can basically use the entire set of items as is. But if you're creating something from scratch and you're creating a completely new survey, that opens up a whole new world of sort of ways that you need to structure your questions to make sure that they are concise and not confusing. So what I'm going to get into for basically the remainder of this lecture is all of what goes into creating these new survey questions and all the sorts of vagaries and pitfalls that can make the creation of new survey questions a bit trickier than you might expect. So the idea of using pre-existing surveys, the idea is that the entire effort of creating new scales from scratch has already been done by someone else who is not you, and you can basically use their hard work to make sure that you're using really good quality scales that have already gone through a pretty rigorous process of validation and development. So to give you an example of what this looks like, this classic nostalgia variable that I reference all the time, whenever I personally measure nostalgia in a survey, I use a pre-existing nostalgia scale. So there's various nostalgia scales that assess things like personal proneness to nostalgia. This article that I've depicted here is an example of some researchers that developed their own personal nostalgia scale. As you can see, they're just in the abstract. Just this scale validation paper was created using 5 distinct studies over the process of developing and validating a very short nostalgia proneness scale. So how is it that the development and validation of a scale could take that long? Well, here's why. Typically, the first step for creating a new scale is to just brainstorm items and questions. So you can see in study 1, they generated a large set of questions that they thought hypothetically might work well for their nostalgia scale. So they first sort of sit and brainstorm as many questions as possible. And then upon analyzing the data, researchers do things like evaluate internal reliability of those items, and they start to evaluate whether or not any of the questions they've written sort of don't belong in this nostalgia scale. So then in the second study, they used a culled down set of 9 items from the 72 they created that they thought would work very well for this secondary study. From there, what researchers often do is they evaluate whether or not the items they've created have what we call subscales. So for example, a solitary construct like nostalgia, you can imagine might be broken down into different sort of sub-constructs within the idea of nostalgia. So maybe there's a distinction between personal nostalgia and historic nostalgia, right? Nostalgia from the events of your personal life versus nostalgia for historical time periods you weren't there for. So researchers want to evaluate whether or not that is true. And then they did multiple iterations of this basic same process whereby they refined the items that they'd created, culled down to as few items as possible, made sure to subject these items to a series of reliability and validity tests, what we call psychometric testing. And in doing so, what they wanted to end up with was a small and effective nostalgia scale that very accurately captured the construct of nostalgia and that would provide really solid, accurate, and reliable indications of someone's level of nostalgia. So, this entire process of just creating this very short nostalgia scale was a very intense process that involved quite a bit more analyses than maybe you would ever be interested in doing. So, if you use a pre existing scale, basically you would get to enjoy the fruits of all of that hard work that researchers who like to publish novel scales have already done. That's the reason they want to publish and create new scales, is for other people to use. And so you can always try and find a pre existing scale to help measure the variable you're trying to measure. But what if you really are trying to create a scale from scratch? How would you feasibly start that process? Well, it starts with the most basic, bare bones validity type, which is your face validity type that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Basically, if you're trying to get a face validity for the questions you want to ask, it's really just a process of asking yourself what questions sort of superficially make sense. You start by thinking about the conceptual definition of your construct or variable, and you just start to brainstorm, what questions do I think would help me tap into that construct? What questions could I pose to participants that would get at that construct I'm interested in? So you have to start somewhere if you're starting from scratch, so you start with face validity. Then from there, it's that whole process of psychometric testing that I alluded to. You have to subject your scale to reliability analysis to make sure the items in the scale belong together. You need to pay close attention to some of those pitfalls of bad survey questions that I mentioned before. So there's a whole host of ways that questions can be poorly worded, and I'm going to walk you through a couple examples of some really bad questions. Some particular pitfalls that you really want to make sure to avoid because they make your questions of a poor quality. Something like a leading question. So a leading question is any question that sort of tries to nudge or prompt your participants to answer in a certain way. This is not a great way to write a question because you want participants' natural responses. You don't want to sort of make them feel like they have to respond in a certain way. A double-barreled question is something that I notice a lot of students when writing questions for the first time tend to fall into. A double-barrel question is distinct from a leading question, but it's still a way that a question can be poorly worded. It's whenever any single question contains multiple questions within it. So double-barreled, meaning like the two barrels of a shotgun. A double-barrel question is one in which the single question asks multiple different things of participants. This is a bad way to write a question because participants won't know which part of the question they're responding to. That means that any responses you get, you really don't know what the truth is. Were participants reporting their agreement to one half of the question or the other, or to both at the same time? This sort of bad wording leads to bad results. Additionally, one thing that you don't need to pay much attention to if you're using a pre-existing scale, for the most part, is how participants will actually be responding. So you need to choose, as the person creating your survey, what ways participants will be able to respond. So do you want to go completely open-ended, as in let people just write their responses in whatever way they want? You might think that this is the best strategy because why not let people answer in whatever way seems the most true about them? Well, to a certain extent, that's great. But on the other hand, if you don't give people much structure in terms of how to respond, you have no control over what information they're going to end up giving you. They might give you completely irrelevant information that you don't need. They might give you information that's completely confusing or just sort of hard to wade through. Additionally, how do you analyze open-ended narratives that participants write? Are you just going to read them and qualitatively evaluate themes? Open-ended questions might seem great to elicit more genuineness and honesty from participants, but the question becomes, what do you do with that information? So, an alternative would be to create a forced or limited response for participants to use. So, something like a Likert scale, in which participants rate their level of disagreement to agreement on a set of numerical multiple choice response options. So, even if you're going the forced response route, you still need to ask yourself some questions about how exactly that's going to work. How much breadth do you want to people's choices? Do you want a 1 to 7 Likert scale or a 1 to 5? Do you want to enable a neutral option perfectly in the middle? As you can see with that question at the bottom, if people were to rate their agreement and have 5 options there, and the scale ranges from very unsatisfied to very satisfied, that middle option, that neutral option, right, that is perfectly in the middle, giving people the option to basically be a fence sitter and not go one way or the other. So if you were to have a response scale that had an odd number of responses, that enables participants to choose an option right in the middle. Now, on the other hand, the response format you see at the top left of the screen, where you have 6 responses, right, there is no perfect middle option. It goes right from slightly disagree at 3 to slightly agree at 4, meaning that there's no option to sit on the fence. You're sort of forcing participants to pick a side. So do you want to enable participants to be neutral, or do you want to force them to pick a side? This is a consideration you'll need to keep in mind if you are creating your scales and questions from scratch. Okay, here's an example of a scale that I've used in the past and how it looks when actually programmed. So again, you guys, for the most part, have been through 293 and you've programmed surveys. Here are the things that you really need to look out for when you're going through this process. The main things that you'll notice here, which again, if you've been through 293, you've already been through this process of me forcing you to think about these things, is that you need to have instructions that match with the actual questions themselves, which then matches the response format. So as you can see here in this meaning in life scale that I've used before, the instructions read, please take a moment to think about what makes your life and existence feel important and significant to you, and then indicate how true the following statements are for you. So this sets participants up to know what the nature of the questions are, and they have a sense of how they will be answering. They'll be rating the extent of the trueness of those statements. So then, since they're rating the trueness of the statements to them, those items, as you can see, are not actually questions. Like I said, they're statements. So I understand my life's meaning. People can then choose to select that it is absolutely untrue to absolutely true. So think about how that instructions matches up to the structure of the items themselves, which then matches up with the response format. All of these things need to make sense together. You wouldn't want to have instructions that indicate that participants will be responding to a series of statements and then have the first question say, do I understand my life's meaning? That just, despite the fact that participants would likely basically get the idea of what you are asking of them, it's just a little bit of poor writing, and you want to eliminate any ambiguity and any confusion possible when you're writing questions up. So making sure instructions match to items, match to response format. This again is a fair amount of effort that if you use a pre-existing scale, likely has already been done for you. Okay, here's just another example of a scale that has a sort of a different setup for instructions versus items versus response. If you want to evaluate participants' mood or emotion, right, you might say indicate the extent to which you feel this way right now at the present moment. And then the items are just a series of emotional states, and they can rate their extent to which they feel that way on a scale from slightly or not at all to extremely. So again, the instructions versus items versus response format here presents a slightly different picture of what participants are going to be doing. So any of these would be perfectly good options for creating a new scale. Key again is just making sure that everything matches up and reads very clearly and very concisely to your participants to eliminate any possible confusion. Then this would be an example of an open-ended question. Participants are just prompted to write about a particular experience. This would be an example of something that looks a lot more open-ended. Okay. Then if you're dealing with your demographic questions, again, since all of these items are a little bit different from one another, even if you're talking something like political affiliation, right, you could use a sliding scale from conservative to liberal, or you could prompt people to merely identify in a categorical way what their political affiliation is. Something like religiosity, again, same thing. It depends on what sort of a question you're trying to ask. That is going to shape the text of the question as well as the available responses that would be appropriate. Some other features in survey creation that make the process, again, a little bit more complicated than you might expect is this idea that participants are not always necessarily going to be inclined to be perfectly honest or accurate when you're dealing in the world of self-report. So people who want to write really slick surveys that circumvent participants' ability to be dishonest, one strategy is to include what we call impossible questions. So if, for example, in the midst of a scale that you've created, you include a question or statement like, "I never lie to make a situation easier," the idea is that any person who's willing to be honest to the detriment of sort of presenting yourself in the best possible light, any of us would really be forced to admit that we have sometimes told a lie to make a situation easier, right? That is something that basically every human person has experienced. So if you were to include a quote unquote impossible question like that, any participant who responds, "Yes, extremely, all the time, I have never done that, I am a perfect angel," you can sort of assume that if they're dishonest about something like that, they're going to be dishonest in general. So including these impossible questions sort of give participants a chance to out themselves as people who are lying to try and make themselves look good. Another strategy to encourage accuracy, not really as a way to identify explicit dishonesty, but as a way to identify people who aren't reading very closely, is to include what we call reverse scored or worded items. Again, I know a lot of you in 293 had these reverse worded items in your surveys, so you're hopefully a little bit familiar with this concept. A reverse worded or scored item is basically going to be some questions throughout the survey that use the opposite or flipped direction or wording from the rest of the items. Essentially, participants who are reading all your questions closely will get to those reverse worded items, and their answer will reflect the fact that the question is in the opposite direction. So anyone who's just going through and smashing that 7 button over and over and over and over because they're bored and lazy and they don't want to read the questions carefully, a reverse worded question is going to catch that person. So anyone who responds to the reverse scored items the same way as the regular items, you know that they're likely not reading very closely. And again, you could eliminate them from your data set. So here's an example of a completely fun and wacky scale that uses some cool reverse items. Disgust sensitivity scale. I've used this in the past. It's a wacky scale, and I'm a fan of it. Disgust is a construct that has many different sort of subcategories to it. So if, for example, you look at that top category of food disgust, you'll notice that the items 2, 3, and 4 are people rating their agreement with things like, "It bothers me to see someone in a restaurant eating messy food with his fingers." Okay, so anyone who responds to that question by saying strongly agree, right, there's someone who is prone to feelings of disgust. You see someone put ketchup on vanilla ice cream and eat it, and that makes you feel disgust. Someone responding highly in the affirmative to finding that disgusting is someone who has a high level of disgust proneness. Now that top item, indicated with that R, I might be willing to try eating monkey meat under some circumstances. See how this is the opposite of the others? Someone who responds highly in the affirmative to that question actually has lower disgust sensitivity. So the basic idea is that if I want to create someone's average food disgust score, I can average together items 2, 3, and 4, the responses to 2, 3, and 4, but I'm going to need to flip that first item because higher values to that question specifically actually indicates less discussed. There's a pretty easy strategy to reverse score that, again, I know a lot of you in 293 had to go through this slightly painful process with me. It's not as hard as it sounds. You basically, just for any item that's reversed, need to flip people's responses. So take, for example, a hypothetical set of responses to that same meaning in life questionnaire. A participant who, let's say, has a really high level of meaning in life, they feel like their life has a lot of purpose and significance, right? They're going to read question 1 and they're going to say mostly true. They're going to read question 2 and similarly, they're at the high end of the scale. Same for items 3 and 4. This is a person high in meaning in life, so they're answering mostly or absolutely true to those first 4 items. The last item is reversed. That statement says my life has no clear purpose. So that's in the opposite direction. So my same hypothetical participant who's responding highly true about those first 4 items, if they're reading closely and accurately responding to the question, their response to that last question 5 should be on the other end of the spectrum. So if I was to average together this participant's responses to meaning in life questions 1 through 5, that last response, that errant 2, is going to greatly pull down their meaning in life average to inaccurate levels. So how do you flip this around? Basically, I'm just going to need to mirror image that 2 to where it accurately would be to indicate a high level of meaning in life. So the easiest way to do that is to just add 1 to the highest response option. So in this case, 7 for absolutely true. Add 1 to that, you get 8. Then you subtract what the participant actually responded. So what this looks like for this particular scale, right? 7 plus 1 gets 8, and subtract that 2. The true response for this participant's question 5 is actually a 6, which accurately reflects their level of meaning in life. Okay, so once I flip their answer so that it's a 6 instead of a 2, then I can average together meaning in life 1, meaning in life 2, meaning in life 3, meaning in life 4, and then that reversed meaning in life 5, and get an accurate sense of just how much this participant feels their life is meaningful. So here's just a handy guide of some guidelines for writing good quality questions, basically the pitfalls to avoid and the things you want to strive for. This is not an exhaustive list. If you read the chapter in Morling on survey creation, there's more, but these are some of the ones that I think are the most important. So things like keep it simple. All things being equal, write shorter questions that are more concise because participants don't like being confused and you don't want their answers to result from confusion. So keep it simple, keep it straightforward. Avoiding those double barrel questions. This goes hand in hand with the idea of simplicity. Do not write a single question that contains multiple parts. If you notice you've created a double barrel question, break it up into 2 different questions. Try and have your language be as neutral as possible to minimize leading questions. Don't confuse people with a whole bunch of double negatives so that they have a hard time understanding how to respond. Minimize the negatives contained in your question. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but this just sort of, again, goes hand in hand with the idea of simplicity. Minimize the negatives that people will be responding to. For clarity, a few things you're going to want to make sure you do is have as consistent possible rating scales. So don't change the response format between questions unless completely necessary. A series of items in the same scale. Keep them with consistent rating scales. Minimize the extent to which your rating options and your response formats are changing. Limiting the number of points on your rating scale, all things being equal, a shorter set of responses is better than more. If you give participants a 1 to 20 series of options and they can respond anywhere along that scale, and 1 is completely disagree and 20 is completely agree, they're just given way too many options in the middle and it's completely unnecessary. Limit the response format. Typically on scales, you're going to see rating scales that are 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 for your Likert scale, maybe even a 1 to 4. That's a pretty good range. I would typically recommend not going higher than 1 to 7. Labeling anchor points for your response format, right? You don't just want to give them a series of 7 bubbles to choose when to click. Contain some anchor points. So make sure to at least label response option 1 and response option 7. If there's a middle neutral point, maybe label that. You don't always need to have a label over every single option, but all things being equal, you want to make sure that participants understand what their responses mean. And then overall, make sure to the extent possible that you're minimizing the length of a survey. Participants don't like reading a whole ton. They don't like exerting a whole lot of effort. People are just lazy. So trying to keep your survey as to the point as possible is going to make sure that participants are giving you at least as much effort as they're capable of. Once they get frustrated at an overly long survey, you've kind of lost them. So all of this is in the service of not writing bad questions, because bad questions absolutely kill a survey. But unfortunately, there are people out there, even people who claim that they understand how polling works, who have written some terrible questions. I'm going to give you some examples of some hypothetical terrible questions, and then I'm going to show you a real example of a genuine terrible survey question that I came across a couple years ago. So here's some examples of bad questions that fail on any of those points that I mentioned before. Something like a leading question would be one in which, again, you're sort of trying to nudge participant in one direction or the other. So something like, don't you think too much political correctness is bad for this country? And then forcing people to say yes, no. Here's why this is a leading question. Political correctness is already sort of a loaded term. It's sort of meant at this point in time to be something that's automatically negative. Just using that term instead of something like respecting other people sort of pushes people to respond to this question negatively. And then, in a slightly more subtle sense, the inclusion of language like don't you think, that's automatically trying to nudge people to agree with you. Saying don't you think is a basically implicit assumption that someone's going to agree with you. So that language, no good. Don't do that. So here's an example of a double-barreled question that, again, this is something that you really want to avoid so as not to confuse participants. So a question like this country is headed in the wrong direction and an independent third-party candidate would help, and having people rate their disagreement to agreement. You might be thinking that this question sounds perfectly good, but it's actually a double-barreled question. It's asking two things at once. This country is headed in the wrong direction, and an independent third-party candidate would help. Those are two separate questions, and this would be better broken up into two distinct questions. So somebody who agreed with this question, you don't know if they're agreeing with one part of the question or both parts. Basically, when people respond to a double-barrel question, you don't have as much of an idea of what they actually meant. So this would be a question that would be a lot more clear if it was broken up into one question that was about their agreement with the country being headed in the wrong direction and their agreement about an independent third-party candidate. Because again, if somebody disagrees with this question, maybe they still think the country is heading in the wrong direction, but they don't think a third-party candidate would help. You don't want that sort of confusion because it limits the extent to which you can make conclusions from your data. Now, those are some hypotheticals that I wrote. Like I mentioned, people who make polls and surveys professionally are not always so perfect at this. But here's an example of a question from an NPR poll. You might think NPR is a good source for good quality polling. This was a question from a couple years ago on the same topic of political correctness that is high octane garbage. And they genuinely reported this as if they really discovered something. So the text of the question itself is, in general, are you in favor of the United States becoming more politically correct and like when people are being more sensitive in their comments about others? Or are you against the country becoming more politically correct and upset that there are too many things people can't say anymore? What the fuck is that? That is the worst question I've ever read. That's not a double barreled, that's a quadruple barreled. There is way too much packed into that question. It is completely confusing. It is way too long. It has way too many parts. It's completely leading. This is one of the worst questions of all time. So NPR polled people using this genuinely awful question, and they concluded, hey, Americans hate political correctness. Well, maybe you just wrote a shitty garbage leading question, and there's actually no solid conclusion you can make when your polling question is this bad. So you want to avoid this because this is terrible. Awful. So if you want to discuss survey creating for your discussion post this week, just think about some scales that you have found, maybe for this experiment that we're doing this semester, concerns about items that you have written or found, and then talk a little bit about survey question pitfalls because there are many, and I want to make sure that you always avoid them. So that'll do it for my conversation, monologue really, on survey creation. I'll pick it back up with sampling.